Charleston, South Carolina in 1842, where magnolia trees perfumed the air with sweetness that masked the smell of human bondage, and white-columned mansions stood as monuments to wealth built on suffering. There existed within the governor's residence a secret that would have destroyed the Rutherford family's political dynasty had it ever been publicly revealed. The governor's mansion sat on East Bay Street overlooking Charleston Harbor, a three-story structure built in the Georgian style with symmetrical windows, a prominent entrance portico, and gardens that stretched toward the waterfront where commercial vessels unloaded cargoes of cotton, rice, and human beings purchased at auction blocks that operated within sight of the state seat of power. Governor Silas Rutherford had occupied the mansion since his election in 1840, and he presided over South Carolina with the absolute authority that characterized political leadership in the antebellum South, commanding not just governmental apparatus, but also the social hierarchy that determined every aspect of life in Charleston's elite circles. What the public didn't know was that the governor's household contained an individual whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, gender, and the boundaries that supposedly separated natural law from human depravity. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Governor Silas Rutherford was 47 years old in 1842, a tall man with the bearing of someone born to command, possessing a voice that could fill the largest legislative chamber and eyes that never wavered when making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He had inherited a rice plantation of 3,000 acres from his father, expanded it through strategic marriages and business partnerships, and leveraged that wealth into a political career that seemed destined for the United States Senate, or perhaps even higher office. Silas believed in the divine ordering of society, the natural superiority of his class and race, and the necessity of maintaining hierarchies that God himself had supposedly ordained. He spoke eloquently about states' rights, property protections, and the preservation of Southern civilization against Northern interference. And his political positions were entirely consistent with those of every other powerful man in South Carolina's government. But in his private life, Silas Rutherford practiced behaviors that would have horrified the very constituency that supported his public positions, demonstrating a capacity for transgression that existed in direct contradiction to his public morality. Katherine Rutherford had married Silas in 1825 when she was 18 years old, and he was 30, a strategic alliance between two prominent Charleston families that consolidated land holdings and political influence in ways that benefited both parties. She was 35 years old in 1842, still beautiful, despite bearing 4 children who had all survived infancy, and she maintained her position as Charleston's premier social hostess through careful attention to propriety and an intuitive understanding of the unspoken rules that governed elite Southern society. Katherine had been educated in a Charleston finishing school where young women learned French, piano, needlework, and the art of managing households that might contain 30 or 40 enslaved individuals. She supervised the governor's mansion staff with meticulous efficiency, planned elaborate social events that reinforced her husband's political connections, and presented to the world a facade of perfect domestic order that concealed needs and desires she could never acknowledge publicly. She had married young to a man chosen by her parents, born children as expected, and performed every duty society demanded. But somewhere beneath the practiced smiles and flawless etiquette existed a woman who had learned to separate her true self from the role she inhabited. The individual who would become the focus of the Rutherford household's darkest secret arrived at the governor's mansion in the spring of 1838, purchased at a Charleston slave market for a price that was 3 times higher than comparable purchases would have commanded. The seller was a rice planter from Beaufort, who explained that he was divesting unusual property that he could no longer maintain due to declining health, and he provided documentation suggesting the individual being sold was 20 years old, healthy and trained in household service. What made this property unusual, and what justified the premium price, was a condition that the seller described clinically as hermaphroditism. The individual possessed anatomical features of both sexes in a configuration that physicians of the era could neither explain nor categorize according to their understanding of human physiology. The person had been given the name Alex by their previous owner, a name chosen specifically because it could be interpreted as either male or female depending on context. And they had spent their entire life existing in an ambiguous space between categories that antebellum society treated as absolute and unchangeable. Governor Rutherford had been present at the auction personally rather than sending an agent, unusual for a man of his status, and he had examined Alex with a clinical thoroughness that made other buyers uncomfortable before placing his bid. Katherine Rutherford was not present at the auction, as respectable women did not attend slave markets, but she had been consulted about the purchase beforehand, and she had agreed that acquiring such an unusual individual might serve purposes that the governor had explained to her in private conversations that no third party would ever hear. Alex arrived at the governor's mansion in April 1838 and was immediately assigned quarters in a section of the slave residence that was separated from other household staff, a small room that could be locked from outside and contained only basic furnishings. They were instructed by the head of household staff that they would report directly to either the governor or his wife, that they were not to speak with other enslaved individuals about their duties, and that absolute discretion was required regarding anything that occurred within the mansion's private chambers. Alex understood without being told explicitly that their survival depended on accepting whatever role the Rutherfords assigned them, and never questioning or resisting the demands that would be made. They had lived long enough in bondage to understand that individuals perceived as unusual or aberrant had even less protection than others who existed within slavery's brutal hierarchies, and that their ambiguous gender status made them particularly vulnerable to treatment that would be considered extreme even by the standards of an institution that normalized human ownership. Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood arrived in Charleston in January 1842 to assume a position as visiting professor of medicine at the Medical College of South Carolina, an institution that had been educating physicians since 1824 and had gained national recognition for its research on diseases endemic to the southern climate. Blackwood was 38 years old, educated at medical schools in Philadelphia and Edinburgh, and he had published several papers on human anatomy that demonstrated both technical expertise and a willingness to challenge prevailing medical orthodoxy. He had been recruited to Charleston specifically to teach advanced anatomy and to conduct research on anatomical variations that might provide insights into human physiology. And his appointment came with an unusual provision that he would be granted access to examine enslaved individuals when medical questions arose that required expert consultation. This provision reflected the antebellum medical establishment's practice of using enslaved bodies for experimental procedures and anatomical study, a system that treated human beings as research subjects without consent or compensation, and that produced medical knowledge literally built on the suffering of those who had no power to refuse participation. Dr. Blackwood arrived at the governor's mansion on February 14, 1842. Summoned by a message from Katherine Rutherford that requested his expertise regarding a household medical matter that required both professional discretion and specialized knowledge. He was escorted to a private sitting room where Katherine explained, with careful attention to maintaining proper social distance and avoiding any suggestion of impropriety, that the household included an individual whose anatomical condition had generated questions that no local physician had been able to adequately answer. She wondered if Dr. Blackwood, given his expertise in anatomical variations and his reputation for scientific objectivity, might be willing to conduct an examination and provide medical documentation of what he observed. The doctor agreed, assuming he was being asked to examine a case of clubfoot or perhaps some other congenital deformity that wealthy families sometimes kept hidden from public view. And he followed Katherine through the mansion's private corridors to a chamber on the third floor that was accessible only through locked doors that she opened with keys kept on her person. Alex was waiting in the examination room, standing beside a medical table that had been installed specifically for this purpose, and Dr. Blackwood's initial confusion about what exactly he had been asked to examine transformed into profound shock as Katherine calmly instructed Alex to disrobe completely for medical evaluation. "What, doctor?" Blackwood observed during that examination would haunt him for the remainder of his life, and ultimately drive him to document evidence that would expose the Rutherford household's secret despite enormous personal and professional risk. Alex's body displayed anatomical features that were intermediate between male and female, in a configuration that challenged fundamental categories that medicine treated as absolute. External genitalia included structures that resembled both penis and clitoris, neither fully developed nor completely absent, alongside what appeared to be partial vaginal opening. Internal examination suggested the presence of ovarian tissue, though Dr. Blackwood could not determine with certainty whether these organs were functional or vestigial. Breast development was present but minimal. Chest proportions were ambiguous, and facial features combined elements that would be characterized as both masculine and feminine, depending on which specific characteristics an observer focused upon. The doctor had read about hermaphroditism in medical texts. Theoretical discussions based on ancient sources and occasional case reports that were generally dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications, but he had never encountered an actual individual whose anatomy so thoroughly defied binary classification. He conducted his examination with clinical detachment that concealed his growing horror about why the governor's wife had specifically requested his expertise and what purposes this individual was being made to serve in the household. Katherine Rutherford observed the examination with an attention to detail that seemed inappropriate for someone supposedly concerned only with medical questions, and when Dr. Blackwood had completed his initial assessment, she asked specific questions about sexual function that no respectable woman would normally ask a physician. Could Alex experience sexual pleasure? Could they potentially impregnate a woman? Could they themselves become pregnant? Were there risks associated with using them for sexual purposes? The clinical language Katherine employed while asking these questions made them even more disturbing, suggesting that she was seeking information that would guide practical decisions about how to utilize Alex's body, rather than abstract medical curiosity about an unusual condition. Dr. Blackwood provided careful answers while trying to process the implications of what was being revealed, explaining that based on his examination he believed Alex possessed some capacity for sexual response. That pregnancy seemed unlikely but couldn't be ruled out entirely without more extensive testing, and that there were no obvious health risks beyond those that would apply to any sexual activity. Katherine thanked him for his expertise, arranged for a substantial fee to be delivered to his office, and requested that he document his findings in a private medical report that would be kept in the governor's personal files rather than submitted to any academic journal or shared with medical colleagues. She emphasized that discretion was absolutely essential, that the governor valued his privacy regarding household matters, and that Dr. Blackwood's continued welcome in Charleston society would depend on his ability to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The doctor agreed to these terms while already knowing that he would violate them, that what he had witnessed demanded documentation that might someday serve as evidence if circumstances ever allowed the Rutherfords to be held accountable for their treatment of Alex. Over the following weeks, Dr. Blackwood created two versions of his examination report. The official version, delivered to Katherine Rutherford as requested, provided clinical description of Alex's anatomical condition without any commentary about the purposes this individual was being made to serve, or the disturbing nature of the questions he had been asked. The unofficial version, kept hidden in his private files, included extensive detail about the context of the examination, Katherine's specific questions about sexual function, and Dr. Blackwood's growing conviction that Alex was being sexually exploited by both the governor and his wife in an arrangement that represented transgression beyond anything he had encountered in his medical career. This secret report described how Alex had stood silent during the examination despite obvious discomfort, how their eyes had remained fixed on the floor in a posture of absolute submission, and how Katherine's demeanor had combined aristocratic authority with something darker that suggested she viewed Alex not as a human being requiring medical care, but as a possession whose capabilities needed to be cataloged for efficient use. Dr. Blackwood began making discreet inquiries among Charleston's medical community about the Rutherford household, carefully avoiding any specific mention of Alex, while trying to determine if other physicians had been consulted about unusual cases involving the governor's property. He learned that the Rutherfords were known for maintaining extremely tight control over their household staff, that several enslaved individuals had disappeared from the mansion over the years under circumstances that were never explained, and that Katherine Rutherford in particular had a reputation for personally supervising aspects of household management that wealthy women typically delegated to senior slaves. One retired physician mentioned in confidence that he had been consulted by Governor Rutherford in 1839 about medical measures that might prevent pregnancy in an enslaved individual without affecting their sexual function, a request that had struck him as unusual, because most slave owners wanted to maximize reproduction among their property rather than prevent it. The physician had provided information about various contraceptive methods while assuming the governor was concerned about preventing pregnancy in a female slave he was sexually exploiting, not realizing that the individual in question might be anatomically ambiguous and that both governor and his wife might be involved in the exploitation. In March 1842, Dr. Blackwood was invited to a dinner party at the governor's mansion, a social event attended by Charleston's political and social elite that celebrated the legislative session's successful conclusion. The doctor attended reluctantly, uncomfortable about maintaining social interaction with the Rutherfords after what he had learned about their household, but unable to decline without causing offense that might damage his professional position. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses served by household staff who moved efficiently through the elegant dining room, and Dr. Blackwood found himself observing the Rutherfords with new attention, noticing details about their interactions that took on disturbing significance in light of what he knew about Alex. Governor Rutherford and Katherine maintained perfect social performance throughout the evening, displaying the effortless grace and mutual consideration that characterized successful elite marriages. But there were moments when glances passed between them that carried private meaning, when references were made to household matters that other guests didn't quite understand, when both of them would briefly smile in ways that suggested shared secrets that no outsider could access. After dinner, while male guests gathered in the governor's study for cigars and political discussion, Silas Rutherford drew Dr. Blackwood aside and thanked him quietly for his medical expertise and professional discretion. The governor explained that Katherine had been pleased with the thoroughness of the examination and the clarity of the doctor's report, and he hoped that Dr. Blackwood would be available for future consultations if medical questions arose regarding any member of the household. There was something in the way Silas phrased this request that made it clear he wasn't simply asking for ongoing medical services, but rather establishing an expectation that Dr. Blackwood would continue providing cover for whatever was happening with Alex, lending medical authority to activities that the doctor had no power to prevent and couldn't expose without destroying his own career and safety. Dr. Blackwood agreed with carefully neutral language while internally committing to document everything he learned, regardless of the personal cost. In April 1842, something happened that would provide Dr. Blackwood with additional evidence about the true nature of the Rutherford household, and ultimately lead to his decision to risk everything by attempting to expose what he had discovered. A young woman named Sarah, who had been part of the mansion's household staff for 3 years, attempted to escape Charleston by stowing away on a merchant vessel that was departing for Philadelphia. She was discovered before the ship left harbor, arrested by city authorities who specialized in capturing fugitive slaves, and returned to Governor Rutherford's custody. Sarah was given 30 lashes in the mansion's courtyard as punishment for her escape attempt, a public display that was witnessed by other household staff as a warning about the consequences of resistance. And she was subsequently confined to the basement for 2 weeks with minimal food and no medical attention for the wounds inflicted during her whipping. Dr. Blackwood learned about Sarah's punishment from another physician who had been consulted about treating an infection that developed in the whip wounds, and he made an unauthorized visit to the governor's mansion claiming he needed to follow up on previous medical consultations. he was grudgingly allowed to examine Sarah. And during those few minutes when he was alone with her in the basement room, she told him things that confirmed his worst suspicions about the Rutherford household. Sarah explained that she had attempted escape because she could no longer endure working in a house where she was forced to facilitate activities that violated everything she believed about decency and morality. She had been assigned to attend to Alex, bringing food to their isolated quarters, and ensuring their cleanliness before they were summoned to private chambers by either the governor or Katherine. Sarah had witnessed enough to understand that Alex was being sexually used by both Rutherfords, that this arrangement had been ongoing since Alex's arrival at the mansion 4 years earlier, and that other household staff who had expressed discomfort about these activities had been sold away or disappeared under circumstances that suggested they had been permanently silenced. Sarah herself expected to be sold or worse once she recovered from her injuries, and she begged Dr. Blackwood to document what was happening in the governor's mansion, even though she knew such documentation would likely be destroyed or suppressed before it could ever lead to any consequences for the Rutherfords. Dr. Blackwood left the mansion that day with a commitment to create a comprehensive record of what he had learned regardless of personal risk. Understanding that Sarah would likely be punished further if anyone learned she had spoken to him, but believing that silence would be an even greater moral failure than the danger his documentation might cause. He spent the following 2 weeks creating a detailed report that described his examination of Alex, his observations about the Rutherford household, Sarah's testimony about what she had witnessed, and his own professional assessment that the governor and his wife were engaging in sustained sexual exploitation of an enslaved individual whose ambiguous gender status made them particularly vulnerable to abuse that transgressed social, moral, and religious boundaries that even slave society nominally recognized. The report ran to 23 pages written in Dr. Blackwood's precise medical hand, and he made 3 copies that he concealed in different locations, understanding that any single copy would likely be discovered and destroyed if the Rutherfords learned of its existence. He considered attempting to deliver the report to federal authorities or abolitionist organizations in the North, but he knew that such efforts would almost certainly be intercepted by Charleston's extensive network of informants who monitored all communication that might threaten slavery's stability. He decided instead to document everything meticulously and wait for an opportunity to safely transmit the evidence to someone who might use it effectively. Knowing that such an opportunity might never arrive, but believing that creating the record was itself a moral imperative, regardless of outcome. In May 1842, Dr. Blackwood received an unexpected visitor at his office, a man who identified himself as James Crawford, an agent working for a Northern abolitionist society that had operatives throughout the South gathering evidence about slavery's atrocities. Crawford explained that his organization had learned about Dr. Blackwood's examination of an unusual individual in the governor's household, that they suspected the Rutherfords were engaged in activities that would be scandalous even by Southern standards, and that they wanted to coordinate with the doctor to obtain documentation that might be used to damage the governor's political career and potentially expose the hypocrisy of South Carolina's elite planter class. Dr. Blackwood was simultaneously relieved to have found a potential outlet for his evidence and terrified that this visitor might be a trap, that Crawford could be an agent provocateur sent by Governor Rutherford to test the doctor's loyalty and identify anyone who might be planning to expose household secrets. He responded cautiously, neither confirming nor denying that he possessed any information about the governor's household. And he asked Crawford to provide proof of his affiliations and methods for safely transmitting documents without being detected by Charleston surveillance systems. Crawford provided names of Northern abolitionists that Dr. Blackwood could verify, along with detailed information about communication networks that existed to help fugitive slaves reach free states. And over the course of several careful conversations, the doctor became convinced that this was a legitimate opportunity rather than an entrapment scheme. In June 1842, Dr. Blackwood provided James Crawford with 1 copy of his comprehensive report, along with additional documentation, including Sarah's testimony and his own observations about the Rutherford household's operations. Crawford promised that the materials would be transported north and published in abolitionist newspapers that would use the scandal to demonstrate the moral corruption inherent in slave society and the hypocrisy of Southern political leaders who claimed to defend Christian civilization, while engaging in practices that violated every religious and moral principle they publicly espoused. The doctor understood that publication would likely destroy his own career and possibly endanger his life, as Charleston society would never forgive someone who had betrayed a prominent family's secrets to abolitionist enemies. But he felt that continued silence would represent an even greater moral failure than whatever personal consequences might follow from exposure. What Dr. Blackwood didn't know was that James Crawford was indeed a legitimate abolitionist agent, but that his organization's communication networks had been partially compromised by Southern counterintelligence operatives who monitored abolitionist activities and worked to prevent damaging information from reaching Northern newspapers. The documents Dr. Blackwood had provided were intercepted during their journey north, and copies were delivered to Governor Rutherford within 2 weeks of the doctor's meeting with Crawford. Silas Rutherford read the reports with his characteristic emotional control, making notes about specific allegations and assessing the degree of threat these documents represented to his political career and social position. The governor concluded that Dr. Blackwood had to be dealt with immediately, that Sarah needed to be permanently silenced, and that Alex would need to be moved to a location where they could never be examined by anyone who might corroborate the doctor's claims. But rather than taking crude action that might itself generate attention and lend credibility to the allegations, Rutherford decided to orchestrate responses that would discredit the doctor while eliminating physical evidence of the household's activities. Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood was found dead in his Charleston office on June 23, 1842, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound that authorities attributed to personal problems that several witnesses came forward to describe. The witnesses, all provided by Governor Rutherford's network, testified that Dr. Blackwood had been acting erratically in recent weeks, making bizarre accusations about prominent citizens, drinking heavily, and expressing suicidal thoughts. A suicide note was discovered in the doctor's handwriting, though several forensic details suggest it was forged. And his death was quickly ruled self-inflicted by a coroner who happened to be politically aligned with Governor Rutherford. The doctor's personal papers were confiscated by city authorities as part of the standard procedure for handling a suicide's estate, and they were subsequently destroyed in a fire that consumed the warehouse where confiscated materials were stored. Dr. Blackwood's hidden copies of his reports were never discovered, either because the searches weren't thorough enough or because Rutherford's agents couldn't find locations where the documents had been concealed. And these materials remained hidden until decades after all the principals in the case had died. Sarah disappeared from the governor's mansion the same week that Dr. Blackwood died, and household staff were told she had been sold to a plantation in Alabama, though no bill of sale was ever recorded and no one in Charleston ever saw her again. The most likely scenario, based on fragmentary evidence that emerged years later, is that Sarah was killed shortly after Dr. Blackwood's death, and her body was disposed of in Charleston Harbor, a fate that befell numerous enslaved individuals who were deemed problematic by their owners, and whose deaths could be arranged without any risk of investigation or punishment. Alex was transferred from the governor's mansion to a remote rice plantation that Silas Rutherford owned in the Low Country, far from Charleston and any possibility of external observation. The official records show that a slave named Alex was registered at the plantation in July 1842, and that this individual worked in the rice fields until their death in 1847 from fever, though there is no way to verify if this was actually the same person who had been kept in the governor's mansion, or if Alex had been killed, and their identity assigned to someone else to create a paper trail that would support the fiction of a normal transfer. Governor Rutherford continued his political career without any public consequences from the scandal that never broke, serving 2 terms as governor, and subsequently winning election to the United States Senate, where he became one of the most vocal defenders of slavery and states' rights until his death in 1859. Katherine Rutherford maintained her position as Charleston's premier social hostess until the Civil War disrupted the society she had helped sustain, and she died in 1867 while living in reduced circumstances in a Charleston that had been devastated by Union occupation and the collapse of the economic system that had supported her lifestyle. The Rutherford family's papers, donated to a South Carolina historical society in the 1890s, contain no reference to Alex, no mention of Dr. Blackwood's examination, and no documentation of anything unusual about the household beyond the standard records of slave ownership and property management. It wasn't until 1934 that one of Dr. Blackwood's hidden reports was discovered by a construction crew demolishing a Charleston building where the doctor had briefly maintained a secondary office. The document was turned over to a local historian who recognized its significance and eventually published a heavily annotated version in a regional history journal. The publication generated brief academic interest and considerable skepticism about whether the report represented genuine documentation or elaborate fiction created by someone with abolitionist sympathies and a flair for sensational narrative. Subsequent historians who have studied the case remain divided about how much of Dr. Blackwood's account represents accurate observation versus exaggeration or complete fabrication. Though most acknowledge that the document at minimum provides insight into abolitionist rhetoric about slavery's moral corruption, even if specific allegations about the Rutherford household can't be independently verified. What is known as this? Charleston society in the 1840s operated under rigid social codes that regulated every aspect of public behavior while creating private spaces where those same codes could be violated with impunity as long as the violations remained hidden from external observation. Enslaved individuals existed in a legal framework that granted their owners nearly absolute power over their bodies, their labor, and their lives, creating conditions where exploitation could occur without any meaningful possibility of resistance or legal consequence. And individuals whose anatomical development placed them outside the binary gender categories that society treated as natural and immutable faced particular vulnerability to abuse, existing in spaces where they could be utilized for purposes that combined sexual exploitation with the transgressive thrill of violating boundaries that supposedly separated natural from unnatural. The story of Alex and the Rutherford household forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how power, secrecy, and social hierarchy combined to enable atrocities that were simultaneously hidden and normalized within elite households. What do you think about this story? Could such systematic abuse of power really remain hidden for generations? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of Charleston history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forbidden stories from America's past, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Remember, the most disturbing histories are often those that powerful families worked hardest to conceal. See you in the next video.